Hi, everyone, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the hosts. Special thank you to Lola for inviting me to be a part of this conference, and thank you to Juliana for that insightful presentation. So my presentation today is based on parts of my forthcoming book on Islamic authority at the Women's Mosque of America. And the paper argues that the Women's Mosque of America, which is the first female-only mosque in the US that was established in 2015, serves as this nascent site for the protection of a new Islamic discourse on sexual violence. And so in some ways, it's interesting hearing from Juliana in terms of how these lived communities don't necessarily start with the Quran. And so sort of in contrast to that, this women's mosque community really begins with the Quran when they start thinking through issues of sexual and domestic violence. And so they sort of serve as this nascent site, as I mentioned, for the production of a new discourse on sexual violence. And this discourse moves beyond textual approaches to law and treats Muslim experiences as a valid source of Islamic knowledge. And so women's mosque khateebahs, or preachers, foreground Muslim women's lived experiences as they're drawing from sacred texts like the Quran. So to start off, I wanted to talk briefly about the classical Islamic jurisprudential tradition, which systematically privileges male power over female bodies, as we saw in some of the Qur'anic quotes that Juliana highlighted. So classical Muslim jurists stipulate that a husband is permitted to physically discipline a disobedient wife, limit her movements to ensure his sexual access to her at any given time, commit marital rape, and take concubines. And so scholars like Keisha Ali and Aisha Chowdhury have shed light on how classical Muslim jurists applied ethical reasoning to regulate the extent to which these rights were permissible. And yet in lived practices, the jurisprudential regulation of sexuality and of sexual violence has not protected women from harm. So scholar Hina Azam shows that the institutionalization of male authority over female bodies has actually further facilitated harm against women with respect to rape laws in several Muslim majority countries. And so it's consequential to think about that on the level of Islamic legal discourse, a wife's right to bodily integrity is seen as secondary to a husband's right to hit her. And so contemporary Muslims with gender egalitarian sensibilities have often found these frameworks on sexual violence morally insufficient and contradictory to their understanding of the Islamic tradition and to their understanding of the Quran. So my research engages these new approaches to conceptualizing Islamic legal discourses on sexual violence in the US Muslim context using the Women's Mosque of America in Los Angeles. So I suggest that by foregrounding lived experiences as one of the primary criterion for Quranic interpretation, rather than formal religious training, the Women's Mosque can actually challenge existing Islamic frameworks on sexual violence. So here I'm drawing on Sa'diyya Shaikh's concept of a tafsir of praxis, in which believers use experiences as a hermeneutical tool that challenges patriarchal exegeses. So in this paper, I analyzed 2 women's mosque sermons to examine new approaches to sexual violence that reflect gender justice. So these new approaches call for an exegetical discourse on sexual violence that goes beyond assuming women's bodily vulnerability and no longer takes for granted the premise that a wife's safety is secondary to a husband's control. So the 2 khutbahs that I analyzed today are both from 2015, which was the mosque's first year, but there have been additional khutbahs that address gender violence, including by Dr. Abla Hassan in 2021, who's actually presenting at this conference later today. But the two khutbahs that I analyze here are from 2015, and they posit women's bodies as an important site of knowledge as they foreground lived experiences as a valid basis to approach Qur'anic exegesis. So to back up a little bit, the Women's Mosque is this emergent religious institution that was founded in 2015, where women call the adhan, the call to prayer, they deliver the khutbahs, they lead prayer, and they exclusively make up the congregation at monthly Jummah Friday prayer services. So its emergence speaks to issues of women's inadequate prayer spaces and exclusion from leadership roles across US mosques. So for its first 2.5 years, the Women's Mosque hosted Jummah at the Pico Union Project, which was a synagogue turned multi-faith facility in downtown LA, before moving locations due to the rising cost of rent. And so the next two Jummahs were at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also in nearby Koreatown, before finally moving to where it continues to be held today, which is the First Unitarian Church of LA. So every month, a different self-identifying woman is invited to serve as khatibah, and she's responsible for leading Jummah and giving a khutbah. And so the khatibah preaches on any subject of her choice in consultation with the executive board, and she must submit an advanced version of her khutbah for approval. And then in 2017, Hasna Maznavi, the mosque's founder, authored a formal set of guidelines for khatibahs called the Khatibah Guidebook. And this is a 16-page document that relays official women's mosque policies and suggestions for khatibahs. And I was really interested in how this guidebook actually shows the mosque's commitment to foregrounding female experience. So for example, it instructs khatibahs to show vulnerability and make the khutbah as personal as possible. And congregants, based on my field work that I conducted in 2017, congregants were very receptive to this approach. And so many of the congregants that I interviewed actually described khutbahs at the Women's Mosque as being much more credible and relatable than the khutbahs that they would hear at their other sort of mainstream mosques, because they were so personal. And so this guidebook indicates that rather than attempt to emulate khutbahs from other mosques, the Women's Mosque specifically cultivates this form of authority that's based on women's experiences. And this criteria for religious leadership departs from traditional conventions that might focus on a particular sacred text and then explicate it. And it demonstrates that the Women's Mosque isn't simply extending their platform to people to women without scholarly backgrounds, but rather they're designing the platform to champion everyday female experiences as something that's valuable in and of itself. And so in order to understand how this concept of experience as authority manifests itself at the Women's Mosque, I look at these khutbahs from Sumaya Abu Bakr, who at the time that she gave this khutbah worked at the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California, and also from Najiba Saeed, who at the time was a professor of interfaith studies at Claremont School of Theology. And so both of these women's khutbahs, Abu Bakr and Saeed, approach sexual violence and domestic abuse by addressing believers' right to compassion, justice, and dignity and bodily integrity. And so both of them root their criticisms of the status quo of sexual violence and domestic abuse in US Muslim communities in Qur'anic exegesis. So they're actually reimagining these classical legal frameworks that are defined by foregrounding male power through this gender egalitarian worldview in which the human body is upheld as sacred. So yeah, they're very much rooting their arguments in the Quran. And so when Abu Bakr gives her khutbah, she addresses the congregation as a survivor of sexual abuse. And so she argues for this Quranic imperative to stand up against sexual violence and address it justly as a community. So she derives that authority from her own status as a survivor, but also from her professional work in advocacy, working with survivors in US Muslim communities. So her khutbah actually shows us how alternative models for gaining religious authority can be sort of obtained or acquired through experience rather than religious education. And so here I'm drawing on Patricia Hill Collins' critique of dominant positivist discourses that privilege rational fact over knowledge derived from emotions and experiences. And so this stark separation of information from ethics, in Hill Collins' view, stands in tension with that Black feminist emphasis on the distinction between knowledge and wisdom. And so wisdom, according to Hill Collins, is conferred through experience. And so within this Black feminist epistemology, lived experiences, emotion, empathy, and personal character are all valid forms of arriving at and assessing different truth claims. So underpinning, going back to Abu Bakr's sermon, is this Quranic concept of rahma, or compassion. And so in her experience, in her khutbah, she describes that it's a lack of compassion that characterizes how Muslims deal with victims of sexual violence by silencing them, blaming them, and shaming them. And so she highlights how a lack of compassion and a lack of willingness to stand up for victims of sexual abuse perpetuate the conditions under which perpetrators of violence continue their abuse of new victims. And so she argues in her khutbah that a culture of silencing has created this illusion of safety in Muslim communities. And she characterizes that silence as the absence of rahmah. So her khutbah is meant to encourage Muslim communities in their entirety, both sort of victims, perpetrators, and also witnesses, to collectively address sexual abuse and begin the healing process. So she notes that rahma is one of the most mentioned concepts in the Quran and the most mentioned attribute of God. And she argues that the Quran provides this moral imperative for human beings to embody compassion in all of their interactions. So this is a very particular interpretive strategy, because she's not highlighting a specific verse and then analyzing it, but she's drawing on these broader themes of the Quran that exist across the text as a whole, and then she's making those themes applicable to particular circumstances. And she's using this method to derive this different form of authority. And by foregrounding the themes of the Quran, Abu Bakr is actually attenuating her voice as the subjective interpreter and sort of giving the appearance of the text is speaking for itself. And so in the next khutbah that I highlight here from Najiba Saeed, it briefly addresses the subject of domestic abuse. And here Saeed uses the Quranic concept of ahsan at-taqweem, of human beings as created in the best of statures, to argue for the importance of bodily integrity and the sacred nature of the body. So Saeed calls for Muslim communities to rise to the challenge of affirming the Quranic characterization of human beings as the best of creation in their practices, by calling on them to embody ahsan at-taqweem. So in her emphasis on bodily dignity, Saeed calls for this new framework that's based in social justice and restorative love. And this framework renders it insufficient to simply limit the amount of violence a husband can commit against his wife. And so for Saeed, it's inadequate to leave the physical safety of a wife at the discretion of her husband, because it violates that sacred nature of the body and the Quranic characterization of humans as the best of creation. So, and then further along in our khutbah, Saeed actually draws this parallel between physical violations of the body in the context of domestic abuse, and broader systems of injustice in the US, where bodies are controlled and violated by the state and by vigilante violence. And so here she's simultaneously speaking to Muslim jurisprudential discussions of verses like Quran 434 that dictate how much a man can harm his wife, while also speaking to issues in the US like police brutality, the criminal justice system, and how it systematically violates and discards particularly Black and brown bodies in the US. And so here she's explicitly challenging Islamic legal frameworks on domestic abuse by positing a new discourse that's based in social justice, which for her is sustained by the Qur'anic concept of human beings as the best of creation. And then she's also connecting these Qur'anic imperatives to strive towards justice in social issues that are plaguing the US. And so ultimately, she's arguing that it's morally insufficient to simply discuss the extent to which violence is permissible in Islamic legal reasoning. And likewise, she's arguing that Muslims have a moral imperative to resist state systems of injustice that violate the sacred nature of the human body at the level of the state. So ultimately, she's again positing the necessity of having to move beyond Islamic legal frameworks that take for granted Muslim women's bodily vulnerability and their susceptibility to violence within their own homes and their own communities. And so in place of this, she's positing this model of marriage and family and community that's rooted in strength that's not defined by exerting force over others, but that's rooted in restorative love and the principles of non-harm and bodily integrity. And so it's worth noting more generally that both of these khateebahs, Sumaya Abu Bakr and Najiba Saeed, are carefully navigating the patriarchal gazes of both the American Muslim and non-Muslim publics. And so they occupy this very precarious position in which their internal critiques of problematic trends within Muslim communities are susceptible to being co-opted by Islamophobic narratives. So Muslim women, while they're seen as oppressed victims of their religion and their men, they nevertheless remain these key targets of anti-Muslim violence in the US. And so Abu Bakr and Saeed are thus adamant in addressing gender violence within Muslim communities still. And so as we saw, Juliana Hammer in her ethnography on American Muslim anti-domestic violence work, she observed that the majority of imams in the US don't actually address domestic violence in their communities unless to briefly declare that it goes against Islamic teachings before avoiding any further engagement. And so it's interesting to think about that in contrast to how the Women's Mosque is, through these two khutbahs and the positive receptions to them, make it clear that members of this community are not willing to remain silent in the so-called service of protecting Muslims from Islamophobia, as are the Muslims engaged in this kind of advocacy work. But nevertheless, Islamophobia is indeed a major concern for Muslim women when they consider whether or not to disclose their experiences of sexual violence to others within and outside of their communities. And so there's this added pressure on Muslim women to stay silent about their experiences of sexual violence because of the shame that people in their communities would inflict on them on the one hand, and the Islamophobic narratives and the Islamophobia that their narratives would fuel on the other hand. So both of these khutbahs that I talked about today push this discourse on sexual violence forward to reflect gender egalitarian values of a number of Muslims in America. And because of that, the Women's Mosque serves as this interesting site for the production of a contemporary gender egalitarian exegesis. And so more specifically in the book, I argue that khateebahs at the Women's Mosque are using Qur'anic concepts like compassion, justice, human beings as the best of creation to produce these new ways to approach sexual violence in Muslim communities. And this coheres with Muslim feminist thinkers Hujran Fazlur Rahman's model of thematic approaches to exegesis, as well as with modern exegetes and progressive activists who take issue with pre-modern interpretations of Quran 434, for example. And so both Abu Bakr and Saeed in their sermons called for these new frameworks where we're compromising the bodily integrity of Muslim women, whether through physical abuse or the broader culture of silencing survivors, reflects upon the moral integrity of a Muslim community as a whole. And so they have provided a way to start reimagining legal frameworks defined by foregrounding male power, by instead sort of thinking and positing a general egalitarian framework from which to approach the Quran, in which the human body is upheld as sacred. And I'll end there.